Larry's a real leader in heart failure, both clinically and clinical research in patients with advanced heart failure, patients who are failing oral therapy and making the transition over to transplantation and LVADs. And he's really pushed us to think about how we talk to patients about that transition. He's going to talk about some of that work today. So thank you, Larry.
Great. So first it's a real honor to be back here. Arnett up on the 7th floor was like, I remember, it's good to see old friends and new friends alike. Eric was one of the biggest proponents of my career, and I owe him and the DCRI a ton of thanks for all the support they've given me. And Dan Mark still sends me articles from AHJ all the time, and so it's fun to be back. So today I want to talk about some of the methods around some work we're doing in decision support around left ventricular assist devices. And I guess the main disclosure I have is after never taking a psychology course like my entire life, all of a sudden I'm doing a lot of psychology, and so it's been fun to collaborate with a lot of different people around this. So I'm going to start with just a prologue about why we're so interested, not only me and even DCRI, because I talked to some people today, but why as a society we're getting so interested in decision making. And I think it's because we typically used to think of classes of treatment decisions as mostly looking like this, that we had a treatment, there was a benefit that way outweighed the risk, and so we provided behavioral support to describe, justify, and recommend the therapy that patients came to us to get. So if I have a patient who's smoking, they come into my office, I tell them, it would be really great if you stopped smoking, and that's kind of the decision support that I would provide for them. But as technology for medical care has really advanced, I think we are increasingly getting into this scenario where the benefits of therapies may be significant, but the risks and burdens of those therapies are also increasingly significant. And so when we get into that scenario where the risks and benefits are more equal and there's equipoise, then we default to shared decision making, where we help patients think through, forecast, and deliberate their options. And so an example of this is if I'm a smoker, and I have been telling you to stop smoking here in Durham for years and years, but you haven't, but now you're 65 and you come to my clinic, should you get a low-dose CT scan for lung cancer screening? And the answer to that question is much less clear than whether you should stop smoking. And so actually CMS now says that if I want to send you for a CT scan for lung screening, this is what the national coverage decision says. A beneficiary must receive a written order for low-dose CT lung cancer screening during a lung cancer screening counseling and shared decision-making visit, which includes the following elements and is appropriately documented in the beneficiary's medical records. And this includes shared decision-making, including the use of one or more decision aids to include benefits and harms of screening, follow-up diagnostic testing, overdiagnosis, false positive rate, and total radiation exposure. And if I don't use a formal decision aid and go through this process in a separate clinical visit, they won't pay for that CT scan that I'll send somebody to do. I think that makes sense. Another closer to home for those of us who do cardiovascular care is if I have a patient with atrial fibrillation and they're at a reasonable risk for stroke and they don't want to be on anticoagulation, I may now refer them to my electrophysiology colleagues who want to put a Watchman device in. And again, now the national coverage decision for left atrial appendage closure says a formal shared decision-making interaction between the patient and provider using an evidence-based decision aid on anticoagulation in patients with non-valvular AFib must occur prior to left atrial appendage closure, must be documented in the medical records, and must include a discussion of benefits, harms, must document an appropriate rationale to seek a non-pharmacological alternative to anticoagulants, taking into account the safety and effectiveness of the device compared to anticoagulants, and have, after being informed of the reported risks of this and a reasonable alternative management strategies, a patient must give informed consent. So other people are entering into this and saying what we actually need to do in terms of the depth and type of decision making that we're doing. So with this context, I want to get into the talk, which is really about how shared decision making plays out in critical illness or people who are facing death. And I think that that's a little twist on some of what I just showed you before. And the first piece of this is that for big decisions like a left ventricular assist device, heuristics, how people make decisions and the emotion that enters into that really complicates it. And so the left ventricular assist device, as many of you know, who've provided care, is one of these complex therapies that I think really does ask for shared decision making. So, you know, I remember actually growing up and watching Barney Clark on television live with his device for a little while, but obviously that was kind of the very beginning of this. And as Dick Cheney showed, we're really getting into an era where left ventricular assist devices are becoming kind of mainstream therapy and being applied to a wide proportion of patients. So this is some work we put together that tried to summarize the benefits and risks of a left ventricular assist device. So if you get a left ventricular assist device at 1 year, you can expect that your survival will be 80% at a year relative to 20% without, and that your quality of life on the KCCQ will improve from about 28 to an average of 70 among those who survive. But there are lots of downsides to these therapies, including the fact that the majority of patients are rehospitalized, that bleeding both early and late is extremely common, as our GI colleagues know, that stroke is not trivial at 10%, that infections are common, that clotting of the device and having to go back for surgery again is not uncommon, and then 20% of people still have ongoing heart failure due to right ventricular dysfunction. So this creates, I think, a very tough choice for patients who are dying of heart failure, where we offer them a therapy that could extend their life but comes with a lot of potential risks and burdens, versus I just want to continue medical therapy until it fails and think about hospice. So we actually I was just talking to Matt Rowe, and he was saying that they have used the Amazon mTurk, and we've done this as well. So we took the survival benefit of LVAD, and we varied the stroke risk for patients and other side effects of the device, and looked at whether people on mTurk who are not patients, 1,000 people answered this survey to say whether they would want to get a device or not want to get a device. And what we found is that as you move the stroke risk from 1% to 10% to 30%, kind of gradually up, that you see that people's decision about whether they'd want to get an LVAD or not actually changes. What's really interesting is the inflection point for whether people would want to get it or not, around 50%, is actually right at what the stroke risk actually is for LVADs. Now those people are kind of, I think, going into this in the way that we use informed consent, which is to weigh the risks and benefits in a utilitarian way, to say, okay, I have severe heart failure, I'm potentially going to succumb to my disease, you're offering me a therapy, and I'm looking at what the risks and benefits and burdens of that are, and then I weigh that and I make a rational decision about whether I should get an LVAD or not. The problem is that it's not that simple. So the first issue is that some people do really, really well with an LVAD. So this is one of my patients, Cliff Phillips, and he got an LVAD 5 years ago. He was literally dying of his heart failure, looked terrible. We were worried we couldn't get him through the surgery. He gets the LVAD, he gets out of the hospital on day 13, and he's never been hospitalized again in 5 years. And he's done incredibly well. He feels great. And he loves to go around and tell all our patients about how great LVAD is, because that's his experience with LVAD. No, he does smoke a little pot occasionally. And he does like the Broncos, yes. Yeah. But we know that this is sometimes what happens with our LVAD patients as well. And that's not captured. Cliff and this patient are not captured very well in the diagram I just showed you. So patients are not necessarily dealing with 80% versus 20%. What they're dealing with is very different life courses that are difficult to predict. So we decided that it would be helpful to develop a decision aid for people. And so we went out and did what we call a needs assessment, to say, okay, let's talk to people, talk to patients who are considering this, people who've gone through it on both sides, talk to their families, talk to caregivers, and ask them what it would be that they would need from a decision aid to help make this better. And so actually Colleen McElvennon, who's in the back, has done a lot of this work, went out and interviewed 22 people who were referred to our institution for destination therapy LVAD. And she interviewed all 22 in a row over about a 3.5-month period. And she found actually a couple of things that were really surprising to us at the time. The one is that we thought, people never turn down DT LVAD. And what we've now consistently found is that at our site, if you really look for them, about 25% of people get referred to us and very quickly decide they don't want this therapy. And we kind of ignore that or didn't really appreciate it because those people fade from your memory pretty quickly for a variety of reasons. The second thing that we found, which is also very obvious now but was not that obvious to me before, is that the minority of people approach this from a utilitarian kind of thought process. So we had a few people that would say, oh, I thought about it a lot, and I weighed the risks and benefits, and I kind of thought about what I want, and I really want to be around for my grandkids, even if it doesn't go very well, so I'm going to get an LVAD. That was not what people said. Some people did, but not very frequently. Most people had an automatic approach, which was they would say, well, there's no choice at all. And so these are some example quotes. You know, somebody who is reflective would say, I don't know if the pump would keep me alive, and if it does, I'm not sure if it would be worth living. Some things are worse than death. But most people said, no, I didn't weigh the pros and cons. I didn't even think twice about it. When they told me I couldn't have a transplant, this was the only option I had, that or push up daisies, so I automatically took this. So this is the way I think people are thinking about this, which isn't really a weighing of risks or benefits. And so we start to get into, I think, how people make decisions, which you all know Dan Ariely quite well from his work here at the Duke campus. But a lot of this work was really championed by Daniel Kahneman and his colleague Tversky, who won the Nobel Prize for prospect theory about how people make decisions. And so kind of the famous experiment that was done is just the way that you present information to people can really influence the way that they make decisions. So here's the classic example where you say, imagine the US is preparing for an outbreak of an unusual Asian disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. 2 alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume the exact scientific estimate of consequences of the programs are as follows. So in program A, 200 people will be saved. In program B, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. Do you want to pick program A or program B? And if you actually just reverse this and say program A is rather than 200 people will automatically be saved, you say 400 people will automatically die versus there's a 1/3 probability nobody will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 will die. Merely flipping whether you're talking about living or dying actually completely flips how people respond to this question. And so this is called prospect theory. It talks about loss aversion and that people are willing to take greater risks to avoid loss than they are to take risks for gain, even if you are asking the exact same question. And so this whole theory about how people have cognitive biases around the way they make decisions that are not utilitarian has literally become, these are all the biases in one figure that I pulled out, where there are literally hundreds that you can describe. They're often very overlapping, but we don't make decisions necessarily by saying, oh, the risks outweigh the benefits, and that's how I get to the answer. So just as an example, this is something that we did to show cognitive biases. So this is a medical student, Arcadia Payne, and one of the things that we noticed is that after this is the original HeartMate XVE device, the HeartMate 1. It's a very big device. It was what initially we put in people and was studied to get LVAD approved for destination therapy. But it's huge. I mean, you have to be even a certain size to get it. And after this second device, the HeartMate 2 came out, this device essentially went away overnight because this device was so much better than the older device in many ways. But what we found is that at our program, literally 5 years after this device had no longer been made, and we asked other places, when we would go around and say, well, do you want to get a HeartMate 2 device or not? We would actually show them this device too. It'd be like, oh, these VADs are really cool, this is the old one, this huge thing, but actually what we're asking you is whether you want to decide to get this or not get a device. So here we are introducing an anchor that has no relevance to the question being asked. And so we went through and we actually we actually did an MTurk survey again and asked people based on watching videos and looking at these, if they had the anchor versus not having the anchor, did they make a different decision? And as it turned out, men did not make a different decision, but women did, which I guess is not that surprising. But it does show you that, again, framing can be important. And then really interesting is that I actually think one of the influences that's extremely powerful in these situations is just fear of death. And as it turns out, there is a theory out there called terror management theory. And there are three people who are accredited with developing this theory. And one of them is at University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. So we've started working with Tom Pazinski, who's really studied how this kind of conscious and subconscious perception of our own mortality actually influences the way that we interact with the world. And colors and changes the way we make decisions. And so we're now just starting to do some work around that, but it's been really fascinating, like I said, to have no psychological background and now be thinking a lot about the psychology of death. So that's been fun. And my final theory around this is really the conclusion of the book Nudge, if you've read any of these kind of popular literature around cognitive theories. And Nudge really argues that we need to understand how people make decisions so that rather than making poor decisions based on the nudges that we receive from our subconsciousness or our kind of way of thinking, that we actually monopolize them in a good way to help us make better decisions about smoking, or at least even engaging the decision around whether I ought to get an LVAD or not, rather than just saying I have no choice because I'm afraid of it. So that has been kind of the first chapter of this, is understanding the way people make decisions. So the second part of this three-part talk is actually to talk about tool development or decision aid development. And this is, I think, much more complicated, as you can imagine, than one would initially think, which is this is not sitting down in an evening and writing down kind of what's the important stuff that goes into a decision and then presenting that to a patient, or worse. I remember when I was a fellow here, I would go to the cath lab and somebody would say, yeah, I'm here for my cath. And I had a blank sheet of paper and I was supposed to write in what were the benefits of cath, what were the risks of cath, and I literally made up the numbers. I mean, who knows what the bleeding risk is? 1 in 500, that's what I always wrote down. So I think developing these tools makes a lot of sense, but it's actually fairly complicated and there's a process around it. So the first thing is that we think of decision aids as being informed consent. And what I would argue is that informed consent to some extent is, one, it's legalese, it's kind of archaic, and I don't think it recognizes the way that people make decisions. So while understanding people's autonomy and making them aware that they can decline therapies is necessary, it's not sufficient to help people make good decisions about whether they should or should not proceed with LVAD or do some other large procedure or therapy. So this is from the ISHLT guidelines. So there were no clinical practice guidelines for left ventricular assist devices and mechanical circulatory support until 2013. And then this document came out from the society that kind of gave lots of guidelines and recommendations about how we should be doing left ventricular assist device therapy. And I think it was a great document. We still use it. I refer to it frequently. And I will give them credit because one of the things they tried to do is in an appendix add a universal consent form that people around the country could use to help make sure that people were actually consenting patients for this procedure. Thumbs up. The problem is that the execution of this is not optimal. So this is a 7-page single-space document that people are supposed to sign to say they want to go ahead with evaluation for LVAD placement. If you run this through a grade level check, it's at the 14.6 grade level. It doesn't have any figures or explanations, and it even has a fair number of spelling errors, which is a separate issue. So I like the intent. I mean, I think science and medicine is progressive, and this is a great start. I don't mean to criticize it, but it shows you in 2013, this is state of the art for helping people make a decision. And that's not good enough. So the other default is you can use informed consent documents, or there's a lot of material out there for patients, but most of that material is actually marketing material made by industry, which is fine. But I would argue that that's also not the gold standard for helping people decide whether they should get a device. And so we actually had another medical student go through and do a systematic search of all the materials out there that people could access to help them decide whether they should proceed with the left ventricular assist device. And there were 77 tools that we found on the internet back about 2 years ago. And only 50% of them mentioned any risk, even though the majority of them, as you can imagine, talked about benefits. And only one out of the 77 mentioned palliative care, hospice, or other alternatives kind of in any detail at all. So with that kind of context, I think you can see why it would be really important to develop kind of a decision aid that tried to address some of the holes that we talked about. And so that's what we did. And the concept of decision aids beyond informed consent is that there's knowledge transfer from the provider to the patient that's facilitated by the decision aid in a standardized way that makes sense in terms of what information do you give, how do you give that information in ways that people can understand. You kind of provide a standard and flesh it out rather than me in the cath lab writing down whatever I want. The second is that you elicit patient preferences for what are they hoping to get out of all this, what's important to them in life, what are the trade-offs and how would they make those. And then the decision aid does not replace the conversation. It's a foundation and a starting point to create conversation and deliberation to come to consensus around those decisions. So I think reconstructing informed consent around this kind of framework, I think, and how decision aids are used is much more helpful. So kind of the Bible for, oops, sorry, I'm on the wrong computer. The Bible for how to develop decision aids comes from the International Patient Decision Aid Standards Collaboration, IPDAS. And they have, if you go to their website, they have an incredible website full of kind of lots of guideline documents, almost like the American Heart Association would have for how to take care of patients with cardiac disease. They have a bunch of guideline documents for how you should make decision aids. How do you deal with uncertainty? How do you present numbers? How do you construct the information? How do you do a needs assessment? And IPDAS is very helpful for that. The one thing that we found, though, is that most of the decision aids that are out there that are developed are kind of for, I think, very cognitive types of decisions. So should I take a statin for my risk of MI in the future? Well, certainly having an MI is emotional, and it may be if I know somebody who had one, but when I'm sitting in the clinic with my primary care provider who tells me that my risk of having an MI is 12% in the next 10 years, and should I take a statin, that's a pretty cognitive decision. And that's where a lot of the decision aids have been made. Some of them are around like prostate cancer therapy. Should I get this therapy versus that? I think it gets a little more emotional when it starts to get into like, what should I do for my breast cancer? But there are not a lot of decision aids out there that I think have really dealt with high stakes decisions like, do I get a left ventricular assist device? And so the IPDAS standards don't really talk about emotion. They do touch on uncertainty. They don't mention that much how you involve other people who are involved in decision, like loved ones or family members. And they don't spend a whole lot of time actually talking about cognitive biases, as I mentioned before. So when we set out to do following IPDAS standards, but thinking about these other issues, we went out to do a needs assessment in terms of interviewing a number of patients who had gone through the process or were considering the process, a number of caregivers, a lot of different clinicians, and then doing a couple of group interviews to figure out what was helpful to people. And we started out by developing a paper decision aid and actually went through 18 versions of this to end up with what we found was an 8-page decision aid that does a couple of things. The first is that rather than starting out with LVADs, it starts out with a decision, which I think is important. It talks about emotion. What are you feeling? How do you want to live the rest of your life? It actually recognizes that this is a tough decision and provides normalizing language around that, which we find to be helpful. It presents options side by side and talks about the uncertainty in those decisions. It tries to summarize complications, and one of the things that's really hard to do is how do you summarize the complications of potentially withdrawing therapy and not going to going to hospice and not going through an operation. And that is actually very challenging to put down into paper for people. And then a lot of people really focus on the burdens of it. What is the therapy like? What does it mean for me? How is it going to change my life? And we found that a lot of information didn't go into that as well in terms of helping people make decisions on benefits and risks. That kind of life changes, burdens piece gets left out. Talking about the inclusion of family, and then a lot of decision aids actually do a values clarification exercise where you kind of say, well, your choice is really to potentially go through a lot of stuff to optimize your chance at survival versus not do a lot of stuff and maybe not live as long. And if you think about that, which side of the spectrum do you fall on? And maybe one of the therapies or one of the treatment courses will fit better with that. So that's kind of where we ended up. Now, one of the things that we found with this, especially I think for a big emotional decision, I was talking to Kevin Thomas, who's been doing work with ICDs, is that patients really aren't super jazzed about making a life or death decision by reading an 8-page pamphlet. What they want to do is they want to meet somebody that has an LVAD. And so we then went to converting that information and what the needs assessment was into a video, which ended up being 26 minutes. And it's interesting, Kevin said that his video was exactly 26 minutes as well, which I guess an N of 2 is now a study. And what we found is that people really wanted to meet people that have the device. And one of the problems that I've seen both with industry materials, and industry is very well in marketing that people want to meet people who've gotten a device and done well with it, as well as on the floor when we have somebody who is thinking about a left ventricular assist device, we often bring a patient by to see them, is that these are extremely biasing. The patients that we have who are willing to come in the hospital and meet somebody who's considering a left ventricular assist device, as you can imagine, are people who have done extremely well with the device. The people who did horribly with the device usually aren't around anymore, or they're in the ICU, or they're really not that happy with us anymore, and aren't real excited to come in and talk to somebody about what it's like to get a left ventricular assist device. So one of the things that creating a decision aid video can do is can allow you to go out and actively solicit patient testimonials that people want, but to try and create kind of a portfolio of what life might look like across the spectrum of possibilities. So some people live, some people die, some people choose to get the device and do well, some people actually choose not to get the device and actually do okay as well too and are happy with their decision. So these are the video that we put together. These are patients that I take care of, and they represent a relatively wide range of possibilities that I think is more representative of the possible outcomes that people can have. And that, to me, is much more powerful and much more what patients want than a 7-page, single-spaced informed consent form that is kind of the standard of care. So we ended up publishing this. Actually, Joe Rogers shepherded this through, and I think is actually one of the more proud contributions that I feel like I've been able to make through the work we've done. And actually, Jocelyn Thompson is our project coordinator and is sitting in the back as well with Colleen. And they have done incredible amount of work, as you can imagine, to get to where we've gone from identifying the problem, doing the needs assessment, developing the 8-page pamphlet, and really getting to what I think is a pretty powerful video, and then having that now available for people to use. So this is actually online. People can go to the website and they can click on this and either get the PDF or they can stream the information. And it's really interesting. We've been looking at organic uptake of this information, and there are about 15 sites around the country now who have kind of organically taken this up. And some of the sites are using it with all their patients. So Emory, Michigan, some other large VAD centers have, I think, felt this hole, this need, and are actually using it. So that's really exciting to see that organic uptake. So the last piece of this trial, or sorry, of this talk is to talk about dissemination and implementation. So one of the interesting things, I was at a PCORI meeting, and in the first 2 years of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, millions and millions of dollars were spent to develop research around how to make medical care more patient-centered or patient-oriented. And Joe Selby actually mentioned that after 2 years, that 60% of the money from PCORI had gone to develop decision aids. That was the majority of all their expenses were just to develop decision aids. And they decided after 2 years that they developed a whole lot of decision aids and nobody was using them. So actually now if you go onto the PCORI site and you say, I want to apply for this grant, you have to answer 4 questions. Like one of them is, are you a US citizen? And one of the questions is, are you developing a decision aid? And if you answer yes to that, you cannot proceed. So, so they basically said, everybody's developing these tools, but nobody's using them. We don't know whether they're helpful. We don't know whether they're an impediment to care. We don't really know. So we had actually cobbled together money mostly from the University of Colorado to develop the decision aid. But then we put together a large proposal to test the implementation and dissemination of the tool that I showed you. And so I'm going to finish this talk with the DECIDE LVAD trial, which is really testing how this gets used in practice. And Duke is one of the sites in this trial. So the other piece I want to focus on a little bit, since you all are kind of a methods-oriented group, is to talk about stepped wedge in terms of how we're getting this out in terms of testing the implementation. So we'll focus on that some as well. This is actually just the study that we're doing, the announcement on the PCORI site. So one of the things that's been great about moving to Colorado is that Russ Glasgow is there, who came up with the REAIM framework. And so the REAIM framework, is many of you are probably familiar with, is a framework for thinking about implementation. And it really looks at 5 domains, and I like to group them into the patient domains first, which is the reach of this, which is if I have something that I want to get out, disseminate and implement out there, what % of people actually get this? So that's important to assess. Because if I have something that's really good for LVAD patients, but only 1% of them are getting it, well, it may work really, really well, but it's not going to have much impact. The second is the classic effectiveness, right? Which is, okay, all of the people that I want to get the LVAD decision aid are getting it, but actually it doesn't make any difference. Well, then that's not helpful. So you need to assess from the patient perspective, are people getting the tool and does it make a difference? And then the second aspect of this is actually the part that I think we don't think about very much, which is on the system side, do people take this up? Like, you know, is Joe Rogers going to use this thing or not? I'm actually not sure. We'll test that. Then how is it implemented? So Joe Rogers says, yeah, I like this well enough. I'm going to use it in practice. But how does he use it? Does he use it the way that we intended? Does he use it a different way? Is that okay? So actually looking at not only do people accept it and adopt it, but how does it play out in practice? And then I think the real key is, after we stop the study or after you've been using it for a while, do people maintain its use? Okay? And so for the DECIDE LVAD trial, we are going through the 6 sites that we're at, and we are looking at what % of patients are who are undergoing evaluation and potentially getting implanted with LVADs, what % of those people are actually getting the decision aid? And then we're looking at, in terms of effectiveness, how do people's knowledge change, but also do the decisions they make about their treatment, do they get an LVAD or not, correlate, or are they concordant with with what they say is important to them? So if they say, I don't want to do a surgery, I don't want to interface with the medical system, I want to deal with quality of life, and I still get an LVAD, is that concordant? And vice versa, if they get scared off by the decision aid and yet they still say that survival is the most important thing to them, well, maybe that's not concordant either. So that's kind of the gold standard of whether decision aids are useful, is do they improve the decisions that are being made in terms of being concordant with people's stated values and preferences. Then we're, in addition to doing that, we're also spending time, and actually Jocelyn's interviewing Carmelo Milano today, to ask about the issues around adoption, implementation, and then once we finish the study, we'll actually come back and see whether people are still using the decision aid, which I hope people will, or at least some version of it that we've ideally modified and upgraded. So in thinking about how to do that, how to roll this out, implement it, and see how it's used, there were some real tricky design considerations, which I think, you know, at DCRI you have dealt with. So the first is that we wanted to implement in real-world setting at multiple sites. As you can imagine, how these kinds of interventions play out is very culturally specific and depends upon the structures of care. So if we only tested this at University of Colorado, we may get a very different answer than we do here at Duke. So it was important to try and get this at multiple sites, which obviously increases complexity and cost of the study. The second was to, that there are challenges around the DT population, because even at Duke, there aren't that many patients that undergo DT LVAD, although I know you guys are pushing the boundaries. And so it's often challenging to do a study like this when at our site we only do maybe 20 DT LVADs a year. So that's not very many patients to draw from. Budget constraints, even with a relatively large study, you can't get that many sites into this. So if you look for most PCORI studies at about $2 million, if you're really looking at something where you're implementing something into care, it's really hard to think about doing more than about 6 sites. And so the last thing that this relates to is our intervention is a decision aid for patients, but who's implementing the decision aid? Well, it's the caregivers and the whole process of care around that. And so we couldn't really do a patient-level intervention, and yet we can only do 5 or 6 sites. So how do you deal with that? And I think the biggest concern we had is this threat of diffusion, which is if we said, well, some of the patients will get the decision aid and some won't, then you're going to end up kind of everybody's really getting the decision aid because the providers are the ones who are really delivering this to the patients. So we wanted to do a site-level approach, and so we thought about doing cluster randomization, but with a very few number of sites, there's obviously issues with that. The advantage is that it limits diffusion, and it's logical for interventions that involve the staff and programs, but obviously it involves, you need a slightly higher number of participants. You have to think about homogeneity among groups, and then when you have a small number of clusters, that's an issue. And then the last thing I didn't mention here is that it would have been very hard for us to roll out this at all the sites all at the same time. So, so we ended up moving to step wedge cluster randomization. And so the way that you think about, when you're thinking about cluster studies, if you have 6 different sites, you can either do a parallel cluster study where you randomize 3 sites to get the intervention and 3 not to get the intervention. And like I said, then you have to roll out all the sites at the same time. And if you're studying how this rolls out, if implementation evaluation is really, really important to you, you have to be doing all the same pieces of implementation evaluation all at the same time, which is a bit of a challenge. Some have done this approach where you kind of roll people over after a little while, and then this is what we ended up doing, which is the stepped wedge approach. And we actually have a little transition period. So this is really kind of, I think, the framework that we applied to this study. So essentially, what we did is this, in this crossover cluster randomized step wedge design, is that we started the study at time 0, and we started collecting information on all the patients about what this process is like, going through deciding whether to get an LVAD or not. And so that continues throughout the study. But at various times across the study, we roll people out to the intervention where they start using the decision aid and everything that goes along with it. And there are some, I think, real advantages to doing this. So the first is that you deal with the diffusion issue. If implementation is a focus of this, the iterative adjustment, it allows for kind of iterative adjustments as you go along. All the clusters end up going through this, so you don't have 3 sites getting implemented. You actually have 6 sites getting implemented. So it really helps you in kind of evaluating the AIM of the study that you're doing. I already mentioned the logistical advantages of being able to study implementation at different times as you go through. And then you gain a little bit in statistical power, which people here know more about than I do probably. And then you obviously want to be careful that there aren't strong time trends, but there is a way to partially adjust for that in the evaluation. I think I want to finish with some of the problems we've had with our stepped wedge design and why you might think twice before doing it. One is that it may extend the length of your study. So we have a really good problem right now with our study, which is that we've enrolled faster than we expected. So we're over-enrolling, which is great, but now we're theoretically exposing people to being enrolled in the study that we didn't actually do a power calculation and say that we needed. The other is we're doing site-based payments for this for people to participate, and now we've over-enrolled, and so now from a budgetary perspective, we'll be okay, but it's certainly an issue when you start doing site-based payments that are more than you expected on your initial budget. But the other issue with this is you really have to continue through the end of the study, because if we were to stop early after we've enrolled everybody, our time in the intervention, if we truncate, is that some site may not even be in the intervention period yet. So that's one thing to think about, is that once you commit to this framework and these rollouts, you've really committed to this period of time. Now you could adjust as you went along and compress this time frame, but that's obviously challenging, and so that's been one of the things that we've struggled with. The other problem is that you assume a consistency not only in what's going on, but in enrollment. So we have one site that was not really enrolling at all. We finally fixed the problem with enrollment, and now they're enrolling really well, but it was correlated with the time that we implemented the intervention. So now we have a site that didn't contribute hardly anything, and all of a sudden they're contributing a lot. Or we have another site where their data quality wasn't very good early. They've improved their data quality, but you have bad data quality in the control period, and now you have good data quality because you fixed it in the intervention period. So those are some major concerns that I have about the conduct of the study that I don't think we fully appreciated when we committed to the stepped wedge design, even though we were quite happy with its ability to allow us to look at 6 different sites implementation. So I'm going to skip this slide. And then just briefly, the only other thing I wanted to mention is that with this stepped wedge design, for better or for worse, we actually purposely started with our own site. Now that creates a little bit of bias, potentially, because we haven't randomized all the sites to when they roll out. But one of the things is that we had to kind of figure out how to do this. And so by randomizing our site first, it allowed us, even though we'd done a little bit of pilot work, to make sure we got the kinks out before we went out to sites that we didn't know very well and really think about how to implement this outside of a comfortable environment. So that's one thing you might think about, and I think there are advantages and disadvantages to that. So I think I'm going to finish there. Again, I wanted to recognize Colleen McElvennon and Jocelyn Thompson, who are in the back, and they can answer some questions that you might have about how to do this kind of study, or of what it's been like to try to put this decision aid into practice. The other thing is I definitely want to give credit to Dan Matlock, who is a geriatrician at the University of Colorado, who knows more about shared decision making than almost anybody I know, and has a real practical approach to thinking about how do people make big decisions about especially cardiovascular devices. And then I also really want to thank Chet Patel, who helped us kind of get this study here at Duke, as well as the MCS team who's been implementing it, including Laura Blue and others, and then the DCRI, who's actually kind of conducting this site-based research for us. So, and I'll just finish. If people have questions, please do email me. And then this, again, is the decision aids that we've developed are available for use for people, and they're at this website, patientdecisionaid.org. So without further ado, I left a little bit of time for questions, and hopefully we could have some discussion. Thank you.
That was great, Larry. I really enjoyed that, and it's a very thoughtful exploration of some really incredibly complicated stuff that doctors aren't necessarily very expert on. There was an early slide that you showed that I thought was raised some interesting points. So the overarching question I have is, and you answered it a little bit, but I want to press on that a little bit more, which is, what is a good decision? How do you know when you've made a good decision? And if you remember that you had a slide that had a very nice enumeration of all the risks and the benefits, sort of one at a time. And I was looking at that and thinking, if somebody gave me that and told me to make a decision, I would be lost. Like, one of the things that is lacking in there is some understanding of the relationship between those individual risks. So I'd like to know, for example, what's the chances, like your patient, of navigating through this, minefield and not hitting any of these mines? What's the rate of having none of those complications? Or what's the rate of having a complication but remaining sort of in the game, if you will? So I took a few hits, but none of them were central hits, as compared to somebody, in that other video, in the other picture you showed, who's tied to every conceivable device and probably never to be heard from again.
So I think so a lot of great points you touched on. I think the main question is, what is a good decision? And what's interesting right now is there's actually a request for proposals out there for a large study to define what is a good decision. So that's come across my email a couple of times recently, and there are a number of people who are interested in developing an outcome for decision making. IPDAS actually talks about that a lot. What are the outcomes for good decision making? And they recognize that there are a lot of shortcomings. The gold.
Study out of it, it suggests that it's like something to be discovered in the world.
Well, so perfect is the enemy of good, and I do think that there are better decisions and worse decisions. So the gold standard that people have used for decision making is knowledge or understanding, and that's actually, if you look at like if you look at a summary, a systematic review of decision aids, and say whether they're effective or not, people look at whether they improve knowledge. And I would argue that the reason that's the gold standard is because it's measurable, but not necessarily because it's the most meaningful. It may not even be that meaningful at all if you believe ignorance is bliss. So, like I said, people have started to get away from, well, should people be knowledgeable, but actually are they making better decisions? And the best measure of that is this treatment value concordance, such that you create this construct where certain treatments should align better with certain value preferences. The problem is that, like, if I ask people, well, do you want to live a long time? They say yes. And then I say, do you want to have good quality of life? And they say yes. And I say, well, I'd kind of like you to decide which one's more important. But then what gets really tricky, like you said, is, what's the pathway that's going to happen? Actually, most of the time, if you get an LVAD and you do well, not only do you live longer, but you feel better. The problem is not everybody does. And everybody that goes for an LVAD has to go through a certain amount of surgery and pain and suffering and burden. And so if somebody says that survival is more important than quality of life, then an LVAD seems to make a lot of sense. But what makes less sense to me is if somebody says, well, I want to live a long time, but quality of life is way more important to me. What's the treatment that's most concordant with that? Is it hospice or is it LVAD? I don't actually know the answer to that because it depends a little bit on whether they have a complication or not from their therapy and whether they find their LVAD burdensome or not. Like Cliff with the Broncos hat, he always says, I like put on my dressing and I go out and I hardly know I have the device anymore. And so his quality of life is terrific. And I struggle with that because most treatment option kind of grids don't align perfectly with a value option grid. And so you get stuck with this. It's great to say that I can measure whether the treatment decisions people are making align with their values, but actually making that happen in real care scenarios is a lot less clear. And so we're going to say in our study that if people value survival and they choose an LVAD, that's concordant. And if they say quality of life and not doing a lot is really important to them, then choosing not to get an LVAD is concordant, but it's clearly messier than that. And then the last issue you talked about, which is how do people look at all of these various outcomes and put them together, is really an issue, I think, of complexity. And I do not know how to handle that. I will tell you that I am very skeptical of a lot of the ways that people do handle it. So people have looked at the work we're doing, and they've said, well, like John Spertus, I love John Spertus. He's like one of the most enthusiastic people I've ever met. And he is great at creating tailored risk models. And so he, working with John, he said, I love what you've done here. You know what we could do is we could take the software we have, and rather than say your risk of stroke is 10%, we could say, well, for this patient, it's 15%, and for this patient, it's 5%. And that would make the decision tool much better. And what I think, and I'd actually like to test, and I think we'll be able to do it, is that they'll program our decision aids so that it'll be a little different for everybody. And I think that those differences in stroke rate don't matter for 95, 99% of people, right? They either want to get an LVAD where the stroke risk is 5 or 15%, or they don't. Now, I showed you the MTurk survey we did, which said that it is sensitive to that. But those are people who are sitting at home on their computer trying to make a little cash before they go pick up their kids. I think when you're sitting in the hospital and you can't breathe and somebody says your stroke rate is 5 versus 15%, I don't know that it makes that much difference. But we'll test that. And then even more complicated than that is what you said, which is how do, we talk about how do I weigh in the AFib literature. It's like, are you worried about a stroke or are you worried about bleeding, right? And you create this dichotomy about like which outcome is more valuable to you. Some people hate bleeding and some people hate stroke. Well, first off, I think that's kind of ridiculous. But as you can see in LVADs, I mean, it's not A versus B. It's like A, B, C, D, E, and I don't even know how you put all that together to make a decision to decide whether this is something I want or don't want when I'm either going to live or I'm going to die in the next year. I'm either going to have a stroke or I'm not going to have a stroke, but I'm not going to have 10% of a stroke, right? I'm still struggling with these things, and that's actually what a lot of what we're doing is. And like I said, I think what we've done is nowhere near perfect, but I think it's better than what was there before. Long answer. Eric?
So I like your last statement that you're still struggling with this, and it's in a way good to see. It's a little ways struggling to see this because it's phenomenal that you're thinking about these issues and addressing it. So it's remarkably important. It's a little troubling because Dan and I experienced at the beginning part of my career a program where we did exactly sort of what you were doing, the shared decision program, Al, Molly, talking about whether you get bypass surgery, angioplasty, or medical therapy, and developed decision models which had personalization versus not personalization, objective numbers versus subjective stuff, and gave video versus hard copy versions of this stuff. And lo and behold, started to find similar things to you, that a patient testimonial goes a long way to beating a survival curve, even though most of us would believe that survival curve and that personalization really might have swung the decision about bypass versus angioplasty. So on the one hand, it's phenomenal that what is old is new again. It's frustrating to realize 20 years has sort of elapsed, and now that we're facing those decisions and don't have much more knowledge. The other thing is that your organizations that you refer to, I love anymore, I'm getting more and more into the appeal to authority groups. And the less and less we know about a field, the more and more we write up long documents to explain what the right things are to do with limited information behind them or evidence defining those. I just was in the unit we're dealing with, how do you rewarm patients? And there's like this incredible protocols built around this stuff.
With
And I'm like,
almost no
well,
data.
but where's any data that really shows whether it's
Yeah.
right or wrong or different, let alone heart failure, I won't go there. But, but when you're struggling now to make decision aids, a lot of the stuff that we've taken as rote, if you really test it out, and you're finding out, it's different. And it depends on who. As you said, the mothers who are doing this online, or the people who are doing this online, are very different than the patient who's facing it in the hospital. And different decisions drive different parts of our brain. There was no question in there in any of that, other than saying.
Well, I'd
it
almost
isn't-
ask you, like, where do you think we should go? I mean, I'm very appreciative of.
Reinventing the wheel, and that, you go back in the literature and realize people have done a lot of this before.
I think there's two parts to it, or maybe multiple parts. Part of it is whether you're, as you were sort of alluding to the first time, your goal is to convey information, your goal is to learn from the patient, or your goal is to try to get a patient to do something you want to do. So when we talk to a patient about smoking cessation, or we're talking about taking a statin when they have coronary disease, the goal isn't necessarily to really get that patient to a decision that's different than ours, which we believe, based on randomized trials, shows that they benefit if they take a statin. Our goal there is just to have the patient come to the same decision we have so that they will adhere.
Yes.
Which is different than yours, which is, I don't know, in your situation, Mrs. Johnson, you're facing really tough ones. And I couldn't tell you what the right decision is. But too often in our business, we have already walked into that discussion with a decision. When you talk to your patient, you've already decided, and you're just trying to get up to that point as quick as you can, probably the better.
They're actually on the OR schedule already. For Adam.
The bottom line is, I think it's wonderful, and I think the ways you're thinking about doing this research is vitally important to at least, inch our way forward in this field where we're pretty much blind, so it's great.
There's two other things I would suggest. One is, you mentioned that you had heuristics up on your early slide, but I didn't see that you really got into the notion of heuristics at all. And it seems to me that patients, and I've dealt with this a lot as well in the intensive care unit, patients generally are able to make heuristic-based decisions. They can't make technical decisions based on parsing out a lot of complex. You need a decision model to sort of figure out what the expected value is of these decisions when you start presenting all this complicated data. And even then, it's not clear that that is going to feel like the right decision, even if you're maximizing utility or whatever it is, quality adjusted life years. So that's one aspect, and related to that is, so I think, the answer may be that you need to somehow put it into the concept of a heuristic. And you've alluded to that a little bit, but I think you're doing something incorrect in that, which is you're making a sort of false dichotomy between want to live longer or want to have quality of life. And with the assumption that if you pick the quality of life thing, you're not entitled to pick the other one. That's a false dichotomy that I don't think the patient is going to accept or be able to deal with. Because it creates like an artificial, I don't know what that means. But, I think that trying to develop, so thinking about it like, I first saw this with the cancer doctors with their idea of Q-twist, which is time outside the hospital without toxicity or symptoms. And something like that is kind of like the airplane ride of, this decision. You get on, you get up, you're at 30,000 feet and you hit severe turbulence, and you're going to spend, what proportion of the total trip is going to be very, very unpleasant. How much of it's going to be smooth air, and how quick are you going to end up back on the ground, and what kind of shape are you going to be in? Something, instead of getting into all these decisions and all the data about stroke or infection,
You're looking for a summary.
that's turbulence. You can't.
Turbulent summary. I like it.
We take care of these patients, and I don't think we could figure out exactly how to parse through some of these things.
Yeah.
I mean, it's either I'm having a crappy time, I'm in the hospital, I feel like shit, or I'm having a good day, and it's sunny outside, and I get to play with my dog. And the rest of it is, why don't you get to play with your dog today? Does that matter?
Well, and that's actually good. We actually collect that data already, which is, days alive and out of the hospital versus how many hospital days. And one of the things that does happen is, if you start having a lot of hospital days, you die. And if you do really well, like Cliff, you get 5 years with no problems. And so actually, Cliff contributes a huge amount of days alive and out of the hospital without turbulence relative to the people who do poorly because they just don't live very long. So they can't contribute to that turbulence metric. But that's probably relevant to people because they're willing to take a risk, potentially, of going through surgery, getting a CABG, getting an LVAD, if they know that if they do get through it, they may have a really good long period of time. But we could quantify that better than we do.
Well, that gets to the other aspect of this, which is the same thing that you see in cancer a lot. You're going to tell me these marginal statistics of what the treatment response is, but what about me? What about somebody in my circumstance with my set of characteristics? Am I going to have the marginal response, or am I going to do better? Am I going to be like Cliff, or am I going to be like the guy that's going to crash and burn,
Well, we just talked about AML, that in AML, whether you do well or not is highly dependent on your age, whereas in an LVAD, what's interesting is your survival is pretty close to 80% almost no matter what, in part because patient selection is pretty narrow. But it is interesting that it kind of depends on the disease, and it actually depends on the decision that you make. So, well, that's actually really helpful. Thanks everybody for coming. I guess some of the fellows are here. I was going to meet with the fellows afterwards. But thank you again. Thanks, Dan.